Narrator calm yet intense tone. June 6, 1944. Date that would forever echo through the pages of history. But before the Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, the world had already endured nearly 5 years of relentless war. Europe was in ruins, and Nazi Germany's shadow had stretched across the continent like a dark storm. The Allies, Britain, the United States, Canada, and the Free French forces had suffered setbacks and sacrifices. Yet by 1943, one thing was clear: the only way to defeat Hitler was to open a new front in Western Europe. That plan was codenamed Operation Overlord, the greatest military invasion ever attempted. Behind closed doors in London and Washington, generals and statesmen plotted every detail. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, faced the most complex military decision of the war: when and where to strike. The coastline of France was heavily fortified. Hitler's Atlantic Wall a chain of bunkers, minefields, and artillery stretched from Norway to Spain. A direct assault would be suicide, unless it was executed with perfect timing and deception. Sound cue distant typewriter clicks, papers shuffling. To confuse the Germans, the Allies created one of the greatest deception operations in history, Operation Bodyguard. They made Hitler believe the invasion would come at Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France. Inflatable tanks, fake radio transmissions, and dummy armies all played their part. Even General George S. Patton was stationed in Kent as a decor commander, making the Germans believe he would lead the main attack. Meanwhile, factories across America and Britain worked day and night. Thousands of landing craft, gliders, and tanks rolled off production lines. Men trained in secrecy, rehearsing amphibious landings on the southern coast of England. Every soldier knew they were part of something bigger than themselves. By the spring of 1944, the Allied forces had gathered nearly 3 million men and an armada of ships stretching as far as the eye could see. The stage was set. The world waited in silence. Soft pause, wind and sea sounds fade in. Eisenhower looked out over the English Channel, his face calm but heavy with responsibility. He knew thousands would die, but he also knew this invasion could end the war. In his pocket, he carried 2 notes, one for success and one in case of failure. The greatest gamble in modern history was about to begin. Narrator: the fate of Europe and perhaps the world rested on the shoulders of ordinary men who would soon do extraordinary things. June 5, 1944, the eve of the invasion. Across southern England, thousands of soldiers waited in silence, packed into ships, tents, and makeshift camps. The air was heavy with anticipation and fear. They knew that by the next dawn, many would never return. The weather was turning against them. Storm clouds rolled over the channel, and waves crashed violently against the coast. Meteorologists warned Eisenhower that high winds and rough seas could make the landings impossible. For a moment, the fate of the invasion and the war hung in the balance. Inside a dimly lit command tent at Southwick House, Eisenhower listened carefully to his weather advisors. The tension was unbearable. If he delayed too long, the Germans might discover their plans. If he went ahead, thousands could drown before even reaching the beach. Sound cue thunder rumbles faintly. Then came a small window of hope. A brief break in the storm was predicted for the early hours of June 6. Eisenhower took a deep breath, looked around the room, and uttered the words that would change history. "Okay, let's go." Those 3 simple words unleashed the greatest military operation mankind had ever seen. As night fell, the skies filled with the hum of engines. Paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions in the United States and the British 6th Airborne Division prepared to leap into darkness. Their mission: to land behind enemy lines and seize key bridges, destroy German defenses, and confuse the enemy before the main invasion began. Sound cue aircraft drones, wind rushing past open doors. Inside the planes, faces were pale under the red cabin light. Some men prayed silently, others clutched photos of loved ones. The jumpmasters shouted, "Stand up, hook up." The green light flicked on, and one by one, they leapt into the night sky. Over Normandy, chaos reigned. Anti-aircraft fire lit up the darkness like fireworks. Paratroopers were scattered miles from their drop zones, landing in flooded fields, trees, and even German-held villages. Yet, despite the confusion, small groups regrouped and began their missions, cutting communication lines, capturing bridges, and ambushing German patrols. Back in England, soldiers aboard the invasion ships tried to sleep, though few could. Letters home were written, some for the last time. Chaplains walked among them, offering comfort and quiet prayers. Narrator softly, the night before D-Day was a night of fear, courage, and destiny. Every man knew that by sunrise, the world would never be the same again. It was dawn on June 6, 1944. The gray light of morning revealed a sight never before seen in history. Over 5,000 ships stretching across the English Channel, battleships, destroyers, transport vessels, landing crafts, an armada so vast, it seemed endless. Aboard them were 156,000 soldiers, Americans, British, Canadians, and free French troops, each prepared to storm the heavily fortified coast of Normandy. The code names of the landing zones were now etched into history: Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, and Sword. Sound cue: naval guns thunder, shells whistling overhead. At 5:30 a.m., the Allied bombardment began. Naval guns fired relentlessly, pounding German bunkers, artillery nests, and machine gun posts. The horizon flashed with explosions as the sky filled with smoke. Above them, thousands of bombers roared overhead, dropping tons of explosives on the coast. Though many missed their targets in the morning haze, beneath the thunder, soldiers waited inside their landing craft, gripping their rifles and crosses. Seasick from the rough waves, the air stank of diesel and fear. Some whispered prayers, others stayed silent. When the ramps finally dropped, they stepped into hell. Sound cue: metal clanging, water splashing, machine guns rattling. At Utah Beach, the landings went relatively smoothly. Strong currents had pushed the American troops nearly a mile off course, but by sheer luck, they found a less defended stretch of beach. General Theodore Roosevelt, JRB, limping with a cane, famously declared, "We'll start the war from right here." But at Omaha Beach, everything went wrong. The German defenses were far stronger than expected. Machine guns, mortars, and artillery rained death upon the first waves of soldiers. Many landing craft were destroyed before even reaching the shore. Men jumped into deep water, their heavy gear dragging them under. Others crawled over bodies and debris, desperate to find cover behind steel obstacles and dunes. The beach was chaos, a nightmare of fire, smoke, and blood. Yet amid the slaughter, small groups of soldiers began to push forward. Led by junior officers and sergeants who refused to give up, they climbed the cliffs, silenced machine gun nests, and opened the path for reinforcements. Soft pause, waves crashing. Distant gunfire fades slightly. By midday, the Allies had gained a fragile foothold along the French coast. The cost was terrible, thousands dead or wounded, but the beachhead was secure. The invasion had begun. Narrator: on the shores of Normandy, courage conquered fear. The tide of war had begun to turn. Narrator: deep, somber tone. By mid-morning on June 6, 1944, the beaches of Normandy had become the most violent place on earth. The sand was torn apart by shellfire, stained, dark with blood, and littered with the wreckage of war. The invasion was underway, but survival was far from certain. At Omaha Beach, the first waves of soldiers had been devastated. Machine guns from the cliffs raked the shore, cutting down anyone who tried to move. The sea itself seemed alive with death, filled with floating helmets, rifles, and bodies. For hours, the men were pinned down, unable to advance. Then, something remarkable happened. Small groups began to act on their own. Officers and NCOs shouted, rallied, and charged forward. Engineers blew gaps in barbed wire and minefields. Soldiers clawed their way up the bluffs, crawling through smoke and mud, throwing grenades into bunkers one by one. Sound cue: explosions, shouting, machine guns echoing in distance. Up above, German defenders fought fiercely. The men of the 352nd Infantry Division had turned every inch of ground into a killing zone. Yet the sheer determination of the Allied troops began to break through. By noon, the Germans were overwhelmed by the relentless assault. At Utah Beach, the landings had gone smoother. American forces under General Barton's 4th Infantry Division pushed inland rapidly, linking up with airborne troops who had dropped the night before. The paratroopers, though scattered, had captured key bridges and crossroads, cutting off German reinforcements. Further east, the British at Gold and Sword Beaches and the Canadians at Juno Beach faced their own brutal battles. German artillery and snipers tore through the first landing waves. Yet, like at Omaha, courage carried the day. By late afternoon, Allied troops had established strong beachheads, bringing in tanks and heavy weapons from the landing craft. Sound cue engines roaring, tank tracks grinding over sand. The German high command was in chaos. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, had warned Hitler that the invasion would come soon. But on the morning of June 6, Rommel was hundreds of miles away in Germany. Hitler himself refused to release armored divisions until it was too late. He believed Normandy was just a diversion, still convinced the real invasion would come at Pas de Calais. By evening, nearly 150,000 Allied soldiers were on French soil. The beaches were secured, but the cost was staggering: over 10,000 casualties in a single day. Narrator quiet, reverent tone. Every inch of sand was paid for in blood, yet their sacrifice gave birth to hope. Hope that tyranny could be defeated, and freedom restored to Europe. By the evening of June 6, 1944, the first and most dangerous step of Operation Overlord had succeeded. The Allies had gained a foothold on the French coast, 5 beaches now linked by blood, courage, and sacrifice. But the battle for Normandy was far from over. The next challenge was to secure the beachhead to bring in reinforcements, supplies, and heavy armor before the Germans could launch a counterattack. Every hour mattered. The sea behind the Allies churned with movement, as wave after wave of ships unloaded men, tanks, fuel, and ammunition. Sound cue ship horns, engines rumbling, waves crashing. The beaches were turned into floating cities of steel and chaos. Engineers worked tirelessly, building makeshift harbors, known as Mulberry Port's vast artificial piers made of concrete and steel that allowed ships to unload directly onto the beaches. These floating harbors became lifelines, enabling the Allies to pour thousands of tons of supplies into Normandy every day. At the same time, the Allies established field hospitals, command posts, and defensive positions. Bulldozers cleared wreckage and dug trenches. Soldiers who had survived the landings now braced themselves for what would come next. The fight inland. Sound cue men shouting orders, gunfire echoing from the distance. The German response was fierce. Field Marshal Rommel returned to the front and immediately ordered counterattacks. Panzer divisions moved toward the coast, determined to throw the invaders back into the sea. But Allied air superiority proved decisive. Fighter bombers, Typhoons, Thunderbolts, and Mustangs patrolled the skies, strafing German convoys and cutting off their reinforcements. Inland, scattered paratrooper units continued their fight. Around Saint-Amand-Glaise, American paratroopers held their ground against repeated assaults, securing vital crossroads. The success of these airborne troops helped link the beaches together, forming a solid Allied front stretching nearly 50 miles along the coast. Still, the cost was enormous. Entire villages were reduced to rubble, civilians hid in basements. As the thunder of artillery rolled across the countryside, the once peaceful fields of Normandy became a patchwork of craters, barbed wire, and burning vehicles. Soft paws wind over distant gunfire. By June 7, the Allies had landed over 175,000 men, along with thousands of vehicles and tons of supplies. The beachhead was secure, but ahead lay the hedgerows of Normandy, dense, tangled fields that would soon become death traps for advancing troops. Narrator's solemn tone. The beaches of Normandy were no longer just a place of invasion. They were the foundation of liberation. The door to Europe had been forced open, but the long road to victory had only begun. With the beaches secured, the Allies turned their focus inland. The goal was clear: break out from Normandy, capture key towns, and link all 5 beachheads into one continuous front. But the soldiers soon discovered that victory in Normandy would be far harder than anyone had imagined. The French countryside was unlike any battlefield they had trained for. The region was divided by hedgerows, thick earthen walls covered with dense vegetation, some centuries old. Each field was like a fortress. The Germans used these natural barriers to their advantage, turning every stretch of farmland into a deadly trap. Sound cue birds faintly chirping, then sudden bursts of gunfire. As Allied troops advanced through the maze-like terrain, they were met with ambushes from hidden machine gun nests, mortars, and snipers. Tanks couldn't maneuver easily, and infantry had to fight yard by yard, field by field. The Germans, especially the panzer divisions, fought with ruthless efficiency. At Omaha and Utah sectors, American forces pushed toward the towns of Carentan and St. L, vital for linking the beachheads. The fighting was brutal. In many places, the air was thick with dust, smoke, and the stench of burning armor. Soldiers described the battlefields as green hell. Meanwhile, the British and Canadians advanced from Gold, Juno, and Sword Beaches, aiming to capture the city of Caen. Caen was a strategic target, a road hub that controlled movement across Normandy, but it was also heavily defended by elite German SS panzer units. The fighting around Caen turned into one of the bloodiest and longest struggles of the campaign. Sound cue tank shells exploding, distant screams, aircraft overhead. Air support became the Allies' greatest weapon. Allied bombers pounded German positions day and night, while fighter planes roamed the skies, attacking any sign of movement. Yet, despite their dominance in the air, progress on the ground was painfully slow. In the fields and villages of Normandy, ordinary soldiers performed acts of extraordinary bravery. Medics crawled under fire to save the wounded. Infantrymen charged through open fields with nothing but determination and luck. Commanders adapted, learning how to use tanks to break through hedgerows by welding steel teeth onto their fronts, turning obstacles into openings. Soft background, distant thunder and wind. By mid-June, after days of relentless combat, the Allied front stretched firmly inland. Towns once under Nazi control now flew Allied flags. But the price was heavy, tens of thousands of casualties on both sides. Narrator's somber tone. The battle for Normandy was not just a fight for land, it was a fight for the soul of Europe, a struggle to break free from tyranny, one field at a time. As American troops fought their way through the western countryside, the British and Canadians faced a different kind of nightmare in the east. The brutal battle for Caen. Caen, medieval city just 10 miles inland from Sword Beach, had been one of the Allies' primary objectives on D-Day itself. But the Germans were determined to hold it at any cost. The fight for this city would become one of the most intense and destructive battles of the Normandy campaign. Sound cue tank engines rumbling, distant artillery. Under the command of General Bernard Montgomery, the British Second Army and Canadian First Army advanced steadily toward Caen, but standing in their way were some of the most battle-hardened soldiers of the Third Reich. The 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlergen, and the Panzer Lehr Division. Many of these German troops were young, fanatically loyal to Hitler, and equipped with deadly Tiger and Panther tanks. The fighting began in early June, and quickly turned into a grinding stalemate. The lush farmlands around Caen were transformed into fields of fire. Every hedgerow, every village, every crossroads fiercely contested. Mortars screamed, tanks burned, and the skies were filled with the roar of Allied bombers. Sound cue planes overhead, explosions rocking the ground. In mid-June, the Allies launched Operation Epsom, a major offensive aimed at encircling Caen. Waves of infantry and tanks pushed forward, supported by artillery and airstrikes. But the Germans counterattacked with ferocity, turning each day into a brutal slugfest. The terrain offered little cover, fields became graveyards for tanks, and villages were reduced to rubble. Soldiers often fought from one destroyed house to another, trading bullets and grenades for every meter gained. Civilians, trapped in their homes, endured unimaginable suffering as their city crumbled around them. By early July, after weeks of relentless combat, Montgomery ordered a final push, Operation Charnwood. Allied bombers unleashed a devastating air assault on Caen, leveling much of the northern part of the city. The next day, British and Canadian forces moved in and finally captured the ruins of northern Caen. Soft pause, quiet wind over the ruins, faint sound of footsteps on rubble. But the victory came at a terrible cost. The city was shattered, its streets reduced to ashes. Over 3,000 civilians lay dead. Yet, the capture of Caen marked a crucial step. It tied down German armor and prevented reinforcements from moving west to counter the Americans. Narrator: somber, reflective tone. In the shattered ruins of Caen, the Allies paid a heavy price, but their sacrifice ensured that the path to liberation remained open. While British and Canadian troops battled for Caen in the east, the Americans were preparing for their own decisive strike in the west. The objective: to break out of the Normandy hedgerows and unleash the full might of Allied power across France. For weeks, U.S. forces had fought bitterly in the dense, claustrophobic terrain around Carentan and Saint-El. Each hedgerow was a fortress, each field a trap. But after relentless combat, the Americans were ready to move. The plan for their breakout was codenamed Operation Cobra. Sound cue: engines starting, planes rumbling overhead. On July 25, 1944, the skies over Normandy darkened with the shadows of nearly 3,000 Allied bombers. Their target: a narrow section of the German front near Saint-El. The bombardment was unlike anything the Germans had faced before. Waves of bombs fell, shaking the ground, flattening defenses, and leaving behind a wasteland of craters and twisted steel. When the dust settled, the U.S. infantry advanced cautiously at first. Then, with growing confidence, German lines were shattered, their communications in chaos. American tanks surged forward, tearing through what was left of the enemy defenses. For the first time since D-Day, the Allies had achieved a true breakthrough. Sound cue: tank shells firing, machine guns echoing, soldiers shouting orders. At the forefront were the men of the U.S. 2nd and 3rd Armored Divisions, led by the fiery General Omar Bradley and the bold General George S. Patton. Once the gap was open, Patton's 3rd Army roared into action, his tanks racing through the countryside with unstoppable speed. The breakout turned into a full-scale advance. Villages that had endured weeks of battle were liberated one after another. Civilians wept with joy as Allied columns rolled through their streets, waving flags and offering flowers to the soldiers who had freed them. But the Germans were not finished yet. Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge and the remnants of the German 7th Army tried desperately to regroup. Hitler, furious and delusional, demanded counterattacks, even as his forces were collapsing under the weight of Allied firepower. Soft pause, distant wind over burnt-out tanks. By early August, the breakout from Normandy had become an unstoppable flood. Patton's armored divisions swept south and east, threatening to encircle entire German armies. The Allies had finally broken the stalemate. The war in France was about to change forever. Narrator: rising tone, inspiring. The cage of Normandy had been broken open. From the blood-soaked hedgerows, Freedom's army began to surge across Europe, unstoppable, unyielding, and united. By early August 1944, the German army in Normandy was collapsing. The American breakout from Operation Cobra had shattered their front lines, and Allied forces were advancing from every direction. The Germans were retreating eastward, desperate to escape the tightening Allied noose. What followed would become known as the Falaise Trap, one of the most decisive and brutal moments of the Normandy campaign. Sound cue: distant explosions, aircraft engines roaring overhead. As General George S. Patton's 3rd Army swept across France, the British and Canadians advanced south from Caen. Their goal: to encircle the retreating German forces near the town of Falaise. The plan was clear: close the trap, destroy the enemy, and end the Battle of Normandy once and for all. Inside the shrinking pocket, nearly 100,000 German soldiers, remnants of the 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, were trapped. The roads were clogged with broken vehicles, burning tanks, and retreating troops. Allied aircraft hunted them mercilessly, strafing convoys and bombarding any movement. The once proud Wehrmacht was now in chaos. Sound cue: machine guns rattling, bombs whistling, soldiers shouting in German and English. The fighting around Falaise, Chambord, and Trun was savage. The Canadians and Poles attacked from the north, while the Americans pushed from the south. The Germans resisted desperately, fighting house to house, trying to keep an escape route open through the narrow Falaise gap. The fields became killing grounds. Allied artillery pounded the roads day and night, turning them into rivers of mud and twisted metal. Survivors later described the scene as hell itself: burned-out tanks, dead horses, and soldiers lying where they fell. The stench of battle thick in the summer air. On August 19th, the trap was finally closed when Polish armored units linked up with the Americans near Chambord. The German pocket was sealed. Thousands of enemy soldiers tried to break out, launching desperate counterattacks, but it was too late. Soft pause, wind, and faint thunder over the battlefield. By August 22 end, the Battle of Falaise was over. Around 50,000 Germans were captured, and nearly 10,000 were killed. What remained of their once formidable army was shattered beyond repair. For the Allies, the victory was total, but it came with a heavy cost. Towns and villages were left in ruins, and the countryside was littered with the wreckage of war. Yet, strategically, Normandy was finally theirs. The road to Paris and to the liberation of France now lay open. Narrator: solemn but hopeful tone. In the ashes of Falaise, the German war machine bled dry. The armies of freedom stood ready to drive the enemy from the heart of Europe. By late August 1944, the Battle of Normandy was over. The Allies had achieved a stunning victory. The German army in France was in full retreat, and the road to Paris lay open. After 4 long years under Nazi occupation, the City of Light was about to be free again. Sound cue: tank engines humming, faint church bells in distance. For the people of Paris, liberation had seemed like a dream. Since 1940, they had lived under the iron rule of the German military. The Gestapo hunted resistance fighters, food was scarce, and fear lingered on every street corner. Yet beneath the surface, the French resistance never stopped fighting. As the Allies advanced closer, the resistance in Paris rose up. On August 19th, police officers and civilians seized weapons and took control of key buildings. Barricades were built in the streets. The tricolor flag banned by the Nazis once again flew from rooftops. Paris was erupting in defiance, but the situation was dangerous. Hitler had given a chilling order: Paris must not fall into the enemy's hands, except as a field of ruins. He commanded General Dietrich von Choltitz, the German military governor, to destroy the city, its bridges, monuments, even the Eiffel Tower. But Choltitz, seeing the futility of resistance, and unwilling to carry out such madness, hesitated. Meanwhile, the Free French 2nd Armored Division, led by General Philippe Leclerc, raced toward the capital, supported by the U.S. 4th Infantry Division. The people of Paris could hear the distant rumble of tanks, the sound of liberation drawing near. Sound cue: gunfire echoes in narrow streets, crowds chanting, "Vive la France." On August 24th, the first French tanks entered the southern outskirts of the city. By the next morning, Allied troops had reached the heart of Paris. The fighting was brief, but fierce, street by street, building by building. At last, on August 25, 1944, German forces surrendered. As the smoke cleared, the bells of Notre Dame Cathedral rang out across the city for the first time in years. Crowds flooded the streets, waving flags, singing, and embracing the soldiers who had freed them. That afternoon, General Charles de Gaulle marched down the Champs-Élysées, declaring, "Paris, Paris outraged, Paris broken, Paris martyred, but Paris liberated." Soft background sound of cheering crowds and music swelling. For the Allies, the liberation of Paris was more than a military victory. It was a symbol of hope. France was free again, and the march toward Germany had begun. Narrator: inspiring tone. The light of freedom burned once more in the heart of Europe. The tide had turned, and it would never turn back. By September 1944, the Allies stood at the doorstep of Germany itself. In just 3 months, they had fought from the beaches of Normandy, across the fields of France, and into the Low Countries. The Nazi war machine was reeling, but though victory seemed near, the toughest battles still lay ahead. Sound cue: rain falling, distant thunder of artillery. After the liberation of Paris, Allied commanders faced a new challenge: momentum. Their armies had advanced faster than supply lines could keep up. Fuel, ammunition, and food were running low. The soldiers pressed on through mud and exhaustion, determined to finish what began on D-Day. The Germans, under Field Marshal Walter Model, dug in along their western border, the so-called Siegfried Line, a vast system of bunkers, dragon's teeth, and barbed wire. Hitler ordered his troops to defend it at all costs. In the north, British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery launched Operation Market Garden, an ambitious plan to seize bridges across the Netherlands and punch straight into Germany. It was daring, but risky. Sound cue: aircraft engines roaring, parachutes opening. On September 17, 1944, thousands of Allied paratroopers descended behind enemy lines, capturing several key bridges. For a brief moment, success seemed within reach, but German resistance stiffened near Arnhem, where British forces were surrounded and overwhelmed. A bridge too far, one commander called it. The operation failed, and the dream of ending the war by Christmas faded away. Meanwhile, in the south, General Patton's Third Army drove relentlessly toward the Moselle River and the fortress city of Metz. Progress was slow and costly. The autumn rains turned the ground to mud, and the German defenders fought with desperate fury. Sound cue: machine guns, soldiers shouting through the wind. For the men on the front lines, it was a bitter fight. They had come so far, yet Germany itself still loomed ahead, dark, defiant, and dangerous. Every village, every bridge, every hill was contested. The closer they got to the German border, the fiercer the resistance became. Still, the Allies pressed on. Town by town, they broke through the defenses. The once invincible Reich was now on the defensive, its armies retreating toward their homeland. Narrator: resolute tone. The Allies had crossed France and reached the gates of Germany. The end was in sight, but before victory could come, they would face one final storm. December 1944. The Allies believed the war in Europe was nearly won. The German army was in retreat, and the front line stretched thin across France and Belgium. Soldiers looked forward to Christmas, home, peace, and rest. But deep within the Ardennes forest, Hitler had other plans. Sound cue: distant thunder of artillery, eerie silence before chaos. In one final desperate gamble, the Führer launched Operation Watch on the Rhine, a massive counteroffensive, aimed at splitting the Allied lines, capturing the port of Antwerp, and forcing a peace on German terms. On the cold morning of December 16, more than 200,000 German troops and 1,000 tanks surged through the fog-covered forests of Belgium and Luxembourg. The attack took the Allies completely by surprise. The American front line, made up mostly of inexperienced or resting divisions, was shattered. The Germans advanced rapidly, pushing west and creating a massive bulge in the Allied lines. Sound cue: gunfire, shouted orders, trucks rumbling through snow. Entire towns were overrun. The weather grounded Allied aircraft, and blizzards turned the roads to ice. For days, the situation grew desperate, but in the chaos, acts of heroism would define the battle. In the small Belgian town of Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded by German forces, cut off from reinforcements, low on food, and freezing in the snow. They refused to surrender. When the Germans demanded their capitulation, American General Anthony McAuliffe famously replied with one word: nuts. It became a symbol of Allied defiance. Sound cue: artillery pounding, distant shouting. As the weather cleared, Allied planes returned to the skies, bombing German supply lines and striking their armor columns. Reinforcements under General George S. Patton raced north through the snow, covering nearly 100 miles in just 48 hours to relieve Bastogne. The tide turned. The German advance stalled. Their fuel supplies ran out, and their troops, now exposed and exhausted, faced relentless Allied counterattacks. By January 1945, the Bulge was crushed. The Germans had thrown their last reserves into the fight and lost. The cost was staggering: over 100,000 casualties, thousands of tanks and guns destroyed. The Allies suffered heavily too, but their line had held. Narrator: solemn but proud tone. In the frozen forests of the Ardennes, the Allies proved their strength once more. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last stand in the West, and it ended in disaster. By March 1945, the war in Europe was nearing its final act. The Allies had crushed Germany's last major offensive at the Battle of the Bulge. Now, the mighty Rhine River, Germany's ancient natural barrier, stood between the Allies and the heart of the Reich. Sound cue: low rumble of artillery, wind over water. For centuries, the Rhine had symbolized the strength of Germany. Its wide waters and steep banks made it a formidable obstacle for any invading army. The Germans had fortified every bridge and expected the Allies to pay dearly for every crossing. But this time, fate and determination were on the Allies' side. As General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group prepared a massive assault, a miraculous event occurred near the town of Remagen. On March 7, 1945, American troops of the 9th Armored Division reached the Ludendorff Bridge, and to their astonishment, found it still standing. The Germans had tried to demolish it, but the charges had failed. Smoke still rose from the damaged structure as the Americans seized their chance. Under heavy fire, engineers and infantrymen dashed across the bridge, bullets whipping past them, explosions rocking the steel frame. Sound cue: machine guns, shouting, echoing explosions. One by one, they made it to the eastern bank. Against all odds, the Allies had established the first foothold inside Germany. The Battle of Remagen became a symbol of courage and speed, a turning point that shocked the German command. Within days, thousands of troops and tanks poured across the bridgehead. German artillery and aircraft tried desperately to destroy the crossing, but the Americans held firm. Even after the bridge collapsed 10 days later, temporary pontoon bridges had already been built to maintain the flow of men and machines. Further north, Field Marshal Montgomery launched Operation Plunder, crossing the Rhine in a massive, coordinated assault supported by paratroopers from Operation Varsity, the largest single-day airborne drop of the war. Sound cue: roaring aircraft, paratroopers shouting, gunfire in distance. By late March, Allied forces were pouring into western Germany from all directions. Cities fell one by one: Cologne, Bonn, and Duisburg. The once impenetrable Reich was crumbling. Narrator: resolute, powerful tone. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. The last great barrier had fallen. Ahead lay the heart of Hitler's empire and the final march to victory. By April 1945, the war in Europe had reached its brutal climax. The Allies had stormed across the Rhine and swept through western Germany, while in the east, the Red Army closed in from Poland. Between them lay the smoldering ruins of the Third Reich and its capital, Berlin. Sound cue: distant explosions, air raid sirens, the low hum of bombers overhead. For Hitler and his remaining loyalists, Berlin was to be the final fortress. Though the city was already in ruins from relentless Allied bombing, Hitler refused to flee. He moved into the Führerbunker, a dark underground shelter beneath the Reich Chancellery, determined to fight to the last breath. Meanwhile, over 2.5 million Soviet troops, commanded by Marshal Zhukov and Marshal Konov, prepared for the assault. The battle would be a storm of steel and blood. On April 16, the Battle of Berlin began. Soviet artillery unleashed one of the heaviest bombardments in history. Tens of thousands of shells pounded the city, turning night into a blinding inferno. The German defenders, a desperate mix of soldiers, Hitler youth, and old men, fought fiercely among the rubble. Sound cue: tanks rumbling, street fighting, shouted orders echoing in German and Russian. House by house, block by block, Berlin became a graveyard. The Soviets advanced slowly, paying in blood for every street corner. Civilians hid in basements as the world above collapsed in fire and smoke. By April 20th, Hitler's 56th birthday, Soviet guns were within range of the city center. Allied bombers still pounded the outskirts. From the west, American and British forces halted at the Elbe River, leaving Berlin to the Soviets. The city was encircled, trapped, just as Hitler's enemies once had been. Inside the bunker, Hitler raged at his generals, issuing phantom orders to divisions that no longer existed. But by April 30, 1945, the end had come. As Soviet troops closed in on the Reich Chancellor Adolf Hitler took his own life. The following day, the Red Army raised the Soviet flag over the Reichstag, symbolizing the fall of Nazi Germany. Sound cue echo of distant gunfire fading into silence. By May 2, the last German defenders in Berlin surrendered. The once mighty capital of the Third Reich was a smoldering wasteland. Over 80,000 soldiers and 100,000 civilians were dead. Narrator solemn yet resolute tone. In the ruins of Berlin, the nightmare of Nazi tyranny was finally crushed. The war that began with conquest and terror ended with fire and ashes. The guns had fallen silent. After nearly 6 years of war, Europe was free. The nightmare that began with tyranny and conquest had ended in liberation and victory. The date was May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, or simply VE Day. Sound cue bells tolling, voices shouting in joy for the Allied soldiers who had fought from Normandy's beaches to Germany's heart. The moment felt unreal. The Third Reich was no more. Adolf Hitler was dead. His armies had surrendered unconditionally. The war that had consumed the world was finally over, at least in Europe. But the road to this moment had been paved with unimaginable sacrifice. Tens of millions had perished, soldiers and civilians alike. Entire cities lay in ruins, families torn apart, nations scarred forever. Soft background music, solemn strings fading into hopeful melody. Yet on this day, sorrow gave way to celebration. Across London, Paris, New York, and Moscow, people poured into the streets waving flags, singing and weeping with relief. The joy was spontaneous, raw, and overwhelming. In London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill stood before cheering crowds, declaring, "We may allow ourselves a brief period of rejoicing, but let us not forget the toil and efforts that lie ahead." In Paris, the Eiffel Tower glittered again. In Moscow, fireworks lit the sky in red and gold. And in Times Square, New York, sailors and nurses embraced as confetti rained down, a moment captured forever in history. Sound cue, crowd cheering, music swelling. In Berlin, the wreckage of the Nazi regime lay silent. The Allied flags, American, British, Soviet, and French, fluttered side by side. The victors now faced the task of rebuilding a broken world and ensuring that such darkness would never rise again. But amid the ruins, there was hope. The nations that had united to defeat fascism now looked to peace. The same courage that stormed the beaches of Normandy, crossed the Rhine, and liberated Europe would now help rebuild it. Narrator reflective, proud tone. From the ashes of war, new dawn rose. The bravery of millions had turned the tide of history. The D-Day invasion had set it all in motion, and now, the dream of freedom had become reality. Closing scene, black and white footage fades to the faces of smiling soldiers, children waving flags, and the words appearing on screen,